Good evening, friends. The book I wish to discuss today is not by any stretch of the imagination a work that we would describe as a classic. But this is a book that I have a lot of affection for. I read it very recently, and it's a book that I think leaves a very pleasant memory of a man who passed on a few years ago. It's a book that is, as the title itself suggests, Conversations with a Gentle Soul. It's a very gentle book. It's a book of conversations with Ahmed Kathrada. Many of you will not have heard of him, but he was one of the titans, one of the giants of the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. And this talk today that I'm doing is a talk that comes in the aftermath of a previous talk that I did some time ago, a book called Shakespeare on Robben Island. And I expect to do a great many more talks on South African history, politics, and literature in the weeks ahead. But let me begin with a story about Ahmed Kathrada and myself. A rather unusual story. It tells us something about what kind of people do get to be known in the world today, and what kind of people do not get to be known, even though they should be known. And perhaps it's a blessing that we don't know much about them, because I say perhaps a blessing, because sometimes when you get too much in the limelight, you do get contaminated by the public sphere. We live in an age of celebrities, right? This is a word that really, frankly, didn't have an existence more or less several decades ago. Today it is an inextricable part of not only the English lexicon, but the working vocabulary of almost everyone. So who was Ahmed Kathrada, and what is that story that I want to tell you about before I launch into the book? Ahmed Kathrada was born in 1929 in August in South Africa, in a place called Zwetserreneke. And he would have been a month younger than my own father. Kathrada passed on a few years ago. My father was deceased in 2014. And so on to the anecdote. About 20 years ago, I can't put a firm date on it, but about 20 years ago, I was sitting at my residence in Encino, California, in front of my computer, and about 11 o'clock in the morning on a weekday, I got a call from the International Students and Visitors Office at UCLA. And they said to me that they had a gentleman who was visiting UCLA. He apparently was giving a lecture somewhere in Los Angeles, and then perhaps he had been called over to UCLA for a meeting or something to that effect. I don't really recall any of those details at all. But he, in any case, had landed up at UCLA, Ahmed Kathrada, and the person who called me said, "We have a gentleman by this name, and he happens to be free for lunch, and there's no one in the office who can go out and have lunch with him, and he doesn't have a lunch appointment because he came over to UCLA for some work, and that work is finished, and he said he would like to meet with some faculty member or some students." And so the person who called me said that, "Would you be available to have lunch with him?" Now, I couldn't believe my ears. I couldn't believe that Ahmed Kathrada, whose letters from Robben Island had been in my collection for a couple of years. It had been published, I think, just a few years before this call. And I knew a great deal about him, or comparatively a great deal about him at that time. And I couldn't believe that someone as distinguished as Ahmed Kathrada was at UCLA and that no one was available to have lunch with him and no one had any interest. And so, of course, I grabbed this opportunity. I quickly showered. I told them that I would be there at noon and asked them to escort him to the faculty center. And then that's where I met Ahmed Kathrada for the first and last time in my life. And I have to say, this happens sometimes that I don't have a very sharp recollection of what transpired in the course of our conversation. It may be partly because he was a gentle soul. That is to say that he's not the kind of person who necessarily left a massive impression on everyone, but I can tell you he left a massive imprint on the history of South Africa. So Robben Island comes into this picture once again. Remember, the last talk, as I mentioned, was Shakespeare on Robben Island. Comes into this picture because Ahmed Kathrada was one of the people who was put on trial along with Nelson Mandela and several others. It's called the Rivonia trial, and the Rivonia trialists, as they're known, were convicted, found guilty, and sentenced to life imprisonment and taken to Robben Island. Now, Ahmed Kathrada would spend 26 years in prison. Not all of them. That's one less, by the way, than Nelson Mandela. Everyone knows about Nelson Mandela. Only a fraction of the people know about Ahmed Kathrada. He spent one less year than Nelson Mandela in prison. And not all of those years were at Robben Island, because he arrived there in 1963-64. And then in 1982, the Rivonia trialists were transferred to Pollsmoor prison, which is on the outskirts of Cape Town. And that is where Kathrada would be lodged for the last 7 years until his release on 15th October 1989. That was, of course, after de Klerk, the president of South Africa, had decided that he was now going to release the Rivonia trialists and eventually other political prisoners, and the road to the end of apartheid would begin at this point. Perhaps a few years earlier, because we know that there were secret negotiations that the apartheid regime had been engaged with, Mandela and the leadership of the ANC for some time. But certainly, officially, it is at this point that we can mark the beginning of the end of apartheid. Now, when he was released, as Kathrada tells you in this book, once again, the book is called Conversations with a Gentle Soul, Ahmed Kathrada in conversation with Sam Venter. The book is published by Picador Africa in 2017, right? So Kathrada says here in this book that when he was released, he was released to a world that was quite foreign to him, as it was indeed to many of the Rivonia trialists. It was a world of ATMs and computers, and a world that he had very little familiarity with. And so, of course, he had to adjust. But in a manner of speaking, he had to adjust his whole life, right? So let me just say a couple more things about Kathrada's biography, and then I want to get into the book, and I want to get into why I think it's such a wonderful work. This Conversations with a Gentle Soul, leading to a very gentle book, makes us think about a gentle world. The last thing perhaps that we're thinking about today, as Gaza is being pulverized, as there's a war going on in Ukraine, right? And the world seems in turmoil, and the United States appears to be an exceedingly ungentle place, as is the case with many other countries, including India, at the present juncture of time. Now, Ahmed Kathrada is an Indian South African, And we know that Indians were brought to South Africa in 1860 as indentured laborers. There is an earlier history which very few people are familiar with. I won't enter into that history now. It's a history of Indians who came, who were brought to South Africa as slaves. And if you go to Cape Town and you go to the Bo-Kaap region, that is where some of that earlier history can be traced. But as I said, that's a different history. The history that most people are familiar with, to the extent that they're familiar with the history of Indians in South Africa, is a history that begins really in 1860, when Indian indentured laborers were brought to Natal. South Africa didn't exist at that time. The Union of South Africa would be another 50 years later. And not, of course, all of the Indians who came to South Africa in the 19th century were indentured laborers. Mohandas Gandhi was among those who were known as passenger Indians, Indians who paid their own passage and came for other reasons, largely as shopkeepers in the case of Gandhi, of course, as a lawyer. The first colored lawyer, okay, in South Africa. But again, that's a rather different story. Now, Kathrada grew up in a place where there were no schools for Indians. And so when he was 8 years old, his father drove him to Johannesburg. And so in that sense, Kathrada, I'm sometimes going to refer to him as Kathy, because that was the name by which he was known to all of his friends, right? Kathy became, in a manner of speaking, an orphan, right? He would lose his father a few years later. At the age of 14, his father passed on. And Kathrada really spent most of his time then, after the age of 8, being brought up by his aunt Fatima, right? And the reason he had to go, as I said, let me just repeat myself here, the reason he had to leave his town, the place where he was born, is because there were no schools for Indians. And even though apartheid hadn't officially been introduced, right? The official doctrine of apartheid is 1948, but we know that a system akin to apartheid had been in practice in the colonies, including Natal and the Cape Colony and Transvaal and the Orange Free State, right? And what then later on becomes South Africa, for a very long period of time, for decades. And we know that forms of racial discrimination had existed for at least something like 200 years, right? Kathrada becomes politically active at the age of 12 and becomes a member of the MK. The MK, the acronym, the initials M as in Mary and K as in what would be the word beginning with K? My goodness, why am I not able to think of kill? Right? So MK, also known as the Umkhonto we Sizwe, the spear of the nation. Okay, so this was the armed wing of the African National Congress, right? Of course, he joined this later on, much later on. And he stayed in it only for a few weeks because, as he points out in this book, he stayed in it for a very short period of time because, frankly, he felt scared, and he didn't like violence very much, right? But Kathrada, in any case, becomes active at the age of 12. So he would have been. We're talking about the early 1940s, and certainly by the late 1940s, 1950, he is politically extremely active. One of the most interesting parts of this book is the description of how he first met Madiba, Nelson Mandela, and I want to point out that Kathrada always refers to Nelson Mandela as his elder brother. When he delivered the eulogy at Mandela's funeral in 2013, right, he refers to him as his elder brother. And there are lots of reasons why he thought of him that way, but he points out that Mandela always looked out for everyone else, always looked out for everyone else. And this is very much a trait that you find in Kathrada himself, right? And Kathrada says in this book, on page 11, so here he's now referring to another person, right? But the quote here I have is a quote from the eulogy that he delivered for Mandela. I'll give the quote and then I'll explain it. So Kathrada said, at this eulogy to Mandela on 15 December 2013, quote, when Walter died, I lost a father, and now I have lost a brother. My life is in a void, and I don't know who to turn to. Right? So Walter here is Walter Sisulu, and I think it's fair to say that we can think of Sisulu, Mandela, and Kathrada as the great trio of the anti-apartheid struggle. Of course, there were other monumentally important people. Oliver Tambo is the first who comes to mind, but Oliver Tambo was in exile. He was not part of the group of people who were the Rivonia trialists, right? And so what Walter and Madiba and Kathy shared together was a life in prison over a very long period of time. And this is what Nelson Mandela wrote. And this here I'm quoting from the book here, 82, 83. So this is what Kathy is telling the interviewer, right? Reminding the interviewer what Nelson Mandela had written in jail. Quote, Walter and Kathy share one common feature which forms an essential part of her friendship and which I value very much. They never hesitate to criticize me for my mistakes, and throughout my political career have served as a mirror through which I can see myself. All right? This book is a book which is not only a testament to Kathy himself, it's a testament to Mandela as well, right? Now, what is that episode that I wanted to relate to you before I move on to what I'm going to describe serially as the main points that interest me in the book, and spend a couple of minutes on each of those points, and conclude with a discussion of the principal distinguishing features of these conversations. But let me first relate that anecdote about their meeting, which is mentioned in this book, which took place in 1950. This is when Kathy and Mandela first met, right? They met in Joburg. They met at a demonstration. Kathy was all in favor of a more militant approach. Mandela wasn't, right? This is what is really quite interesting, okay? And it's interesting because it points to a later characteristic of Mandela, that Mandela seemed to be the kind of person who some people argued had more of a kind of a bourgeois outlook, was someone who hesitated to be militant, hesitated to be confrontational. But let's not forget that it was Nelson Mandela who was the principal person behind the creation of the armed wing, the Umkhonto we Sizwe, the armed wing of the ANC, right? But here, let me just very briefly relate to you, and I think that this is one of the interesting things, is the gentle way as well in which the Sam Venter, the interviewer or the conversationalist, right, the interlocutor with whom Kathy is engaged here, the way in which this person is able to elicit some of this information, and she, including the information about how they first ran into each other on a street in downtown Johannesburg in 1950. This is on pages 19 to 20, and the person says it was a thrilling but dangerous time. Kathy was involved in the organization of a national strike against the Suppression of Communism Act, outlawing the South African Communist Party, and ultimately, of course, the ANC and the Pan-Africanist Congress. Mandela's African National Congress Youth League, so at that point he was a member of the Youth League, right, opposed the strike. Kathy, a member of the Communist Party, promoted it. So they had differing views at that point in time. Eventually the strike went ahead. But what Sam Venter is trying to suggest is that, look, I mean, they started with rather different outlooks, but in the end, indeed, in the middle, they began to converge, and they became extraordinary soulmates. For all those who are interested in the life of Mandela, I would beseech you to also look into the life of Kathy, or Kathrada, as he is known, right? So what are some of the principal things that interest me about this book? I'm going to make 10 points here very briefly. The first is he talks about the way in which he and all of the others on Robben Island devoured newspapers, right? For the first 16 years, roughly from 1964 to 1980, they had no access to newspapers. There were occasional bits and pieces of news that were smuggled in, right? But I'm just speaking about having access to a full newspaper, right? Being able to read the news. Newspapers were prohibited, and they devoured the newspapers. So if you look at Eddie Daniels' memoir on Robben Island, or some of the other books that have been written by ex-prisoners, this again is a point that comes across. It's a point that comes across in this conversation as well. And of course, it's a point that interests me as someone who reads at least 2 or 3 newspapers every day. And I think that the culture of the newspaper has changed enormously. I don't know what it would have been like if somebody like Kathrada and Mandela were, let's say, people of that sensibility were in jail today. What would it mean for them to have or not have access to a newspaper, given that the newspaper no longer has the same kind of currency that it used to have in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, indeed all the way until really the beginning of the internet age, and particularly the beginning of what we might describe as social media, right? So that's the first thing, is his description of the way in which they would devour the news, and it makes us think about the culture of newspapers. The second point, it's a point I've actually made. I just want to reinforce it here because it's something that one sees constantly in this book. One sees it in some of Kathrada's other writings as well. And in a subsequent talk, which will take place very soon thereafter, in a few days, I hope, I'm going to actually, another talk on Kathrada, I'm actually going to sort of share with you some images from his prison notebooks, that is the manuscripts of these notebooks, which I have myself seen, right? So you see in these conversations this constant allusion to Madiba as the elder brother, right? And you get a set of reflections on his personality. But this also leads to some very interesting stories. And so that's why I'm reinforcing this point now, because it gives me an occasion to give you one of these stories. So when Mandela was on the run, he would change, he would put on a disguise, and he changed his disguise from time to time. And one of the people who helped, and I'm now speaking about the early 1960s, before Mandela was apprehended and then put on trial, one of the people who really aided him in this was in his efforts to evade capture by the police, by the South African security police, was Kathrada. And so here is one anecdote. It's a lovely anecdote. This appears on page 23, and Kathy here tells the interviewer the following, quote, "Once he," that is Mandela, "was dressed in overalls as a farm worker. Molvi Chachalia, a South African Indian Congress leader, said he had arranged with a woman that some chap will come and stay at her house." He hasn't told her the identity of the person, right? And here he turns up. Now, this was a conservative Indian woman, not young, but very conservative. And here comes this chap, not with Maulvi Chachalia. He didn't tell her it was going to be a black man. Didn't tell her he's going to be wearing overalls, right? A black man in the home of an Indian woman. A black man in overalls. I mean, they're obviously suggesting someone who's coming from really a working class background, a farmhand. And this is a conservative Indian woman. So this anecdote also makes us think about what were the social relations between Indians and black people. And it's a very important question, of course, as it would be in any context, but it takes on a particular resonance in South Africa, because South Africa is certainly one country where the Indians unquestionably played a really important role in the anti-apartheid struggle, and where to some extent we can say relations between Indians and Africans were quite different than they were in some other countries where you have black people and Indian people in large numbers, including countries such as Trinidad and Guyana, not to mention, obviously, countries in East Africa, right? Okay. So here, let me just finish the quote. He didn't tell her it was going to be a black man, didn't tell her he's going to be wearing overalls. The idea that the average Indian woman had of a black man then was as a servant. They knew blacks as servants and not as intellectuals, lawyers. And here comes this quote, servants in overalls. She was surprised. And Kathy says, Madiba said she nearly fainted. We laugh at the imagined scene, right? So the book points out that most of Kathy's life is peppered with stories about Nelson Mandela. He dips into that memory bank as if it is a sacred well, nourishing him. The lives of great people nourish one, you know. They continue to nourish people long after they have passed on. And by great here, I mean, of course, a person, you know, not a person who has acquired a reputation necessarily for good or bad, a person of enormous ethical integrity, right? A person who lifts everyone else up with them. And this is very interesting, that one of the things about this book is that each of these chapters begins with an epitaph. Usually the epitaph is a quote from a letter written by Kathrada to a friend or to a family member from prison, but some of the epitaphs are drawn from the readings that Kathrada did and the copious hundreds of pages of quotations that he copied, right, into his notebooks. And I want to just give you an indication of two of these quotations. In my subsequent talk, I will talk about Kathrada's reading. So here is page 31. The chapter is called The Spirit of Youth, and this is the epitaph with which the chapter begins. This is from Ibsen, and this was copied into Kathrada's notebook. The spirit of truth and the spirit of freedom, they are the pillars of society. As simple as that, right? And then another one, and this will take you back to what I just said about what it means to be a great person, how this person lifts everyone else up, right? But here's a little interesting twist. So page 187, the chapter is called We Must Share, and the epitaph is from G.K. Chesterton. Quote, again copied by Kathrada into one of his notebooks. Quote, there is a great man who makes every man feel small. But the real great man is the man who makes every man feel great. End quote. Right? So this was the characteristic of Madiba. And this is why Kathrada really looked up to him. I don't think there's any question about that at all. But there are many other places where he describes, what kind of person Mandela was, so that, once Kathrada had this enormous back pain, he could barely move, and this had been going on for weeks. And so finally, he's taken to the infirmary or the clinic at Robben Island, he's put on a bed and he's there for several days, And Kathrada describes how Mandela would just come and sit by him hour after hour. To be a leader means to lead by example. But Mandela was also a man of enormous humor, as was Kathrada. And here's this wonderful anecdote. I've not seen it related anywhere else. This appears on page 30. So where Kathy is talking about how they would, this is after they had been released, many years after they had been released, and Mandela, of course, is the father of the nation and all of that, and he and Barbara Hogan, who became Kathrada's partner towards the end of his life, they had gone to visit Mayibuye at his home, and he was speaking on the telephone. And so, when they come and visit and he's speaking on the telephones, he just motions them to wait while he wraps up his call. And then here is a passage. So he says, page 30, "Yes, Elizabeth. Okay, goodbye, Elizabeth." So naturally, I asked him, "Now, who is this Elizabeth?" He said, "The Queen." So I said to him, "But how can you call her Elizabeth?" He says, "Well, she calls me Nelson, so I call her Elizabeth." End quote. Right? All right. So moving on now to some of the other aspects of this absolutely wonderful book, a very gentle book. There is a point that Kathrada makes repeatedly about the fact that the only kind of freedom worth having is a freedom that comes with responsibility. And we could see that this is, in fact, a point that not only, again, runs through the book, through the conversations, but it's a point exemplified by Kathrada in his own life, right? It is, fourthly, the affection for children. That is really remarkable as well in Kathrada's life. This is something that is true of some of the other Robben Islanders as well. At some point, again, I'm going to speak about a man. I've been in conversations with him, another Indian South African who spent 10 years on Robben Island by the name of Marcus Solomon, and who some years after his release began to work with children and did enormously interesting work with children. But one of the chapters here is a chapter called "Children Know No Color," right? That this idea of racial consciousness, the idea of white, black, colored, Asian, whatever the case may be, it is Ahmed Kathrada's contention. I know that scholars, of course, might take a different view, and scholars might say that, well, this is a pleasant way to think about it, but we have to deal with a world where race is a fundamental issue and all of that. So they might take issue with some of the ways in which he characterizes when he says that, look, children don't really grow up with any sense of race at all. It's really instilled into them. But what this affection of children is about something else. In some ways, it's about, of course, their innocence. This is what Kathrada is really trying to signify. But what struck me most was the fact that on a number of occasions he points out that the most painful part of his experience of being on Robben Island was, guess what? That for 20 years, some 20 years, he never even heard a child's voice. There is something delightful about that peal of laughter that just comes out from a child. Right? And he says that the only people who had children, of course, were the wardens, the wardens who were married, and they ensured that their children were never within sight and never within the hearing of the prisoners. So he says it was 20 years almost before he saw a child, right? And this was the most painful thing for him in all the years that he spent on Robben Island. And he says characteristically that all children in some ways really are my children. They became my children, And when he was released from prison, I think the most wondrous moments that he had, apart from those that he had with Madiba, he had those wondrous moments, of course, with Madiba or Mandela on Robben Island and Paulsmoor, right? Prison. But the most wonderful moments, other than that, were unquestionably really with children. Right? Fifth, what is remarkable is no bitterness, no hatred, none whatsoever. Once again, something that I have found to be true of some of the other people who served time on Robben Island. I think that this is something that we need to study a great deal more. I think that this is also really true, I would say, of the anti-colonial struggle in India under Gandhi. I think this is also true of the American civil rights movement. I want to suggest that this is a characteristic trait, really, that really only comes out of nonviolent movements. And in some fundamental ways, the movement in South Africa really was a nonviolent movement, right? It's interesting that the interviewer picks up on this, probes Sam Venter probes Kathrada on this, right? This is so this in this conversation here now I'm around page 200, 203, 204. It's also related according to Kathy's interlocutor. This is what she imbibes from the conversation: this lack of bitterness, this lack of hatred towards the people who were their oppressors. Right? It's also related to the kind of affection that Kathy had for children. Right? But I want to just take a quote from the conversation, page 204. Where Venter says, quote, "You of all people certainly have good cause to hate, but I have never heard you express hatred against anyone." And Kathy replies, "Fortunately, my nature will not allow me to harbor hatred for anybody, no matter how deeply he may have wounded my feelings." Your nature. It must also take a bit of work, says Venter. Kathy, I don't know. I don't think you study towards that. I suppose it comes naturally. I don't know. Maybe it comes from my childhood when I started studying about Gandhi. I don't know. Maybe that influenced me. What do you actually think about hatred and bitterness? My standard answer is, says Kathy, emotions like bitterness, hatred, and revenge are negative emotions. The people who harbor them suffer more than the people towards whom they are directed. End quote. Right? There is a discussion of Robben Island University in this book. This is a discussion I will take up later on. It's a discussion that, of course, I have already anticipated in my book talk on Shakespeare on Robben Island. And there are many other great characteristics. I had jotted down a great many points, but I think that I have given enough of a flavor of this book, including the ways in which Kathy survived the prison regime. So I think when I speak about the notebooks and speak about his habits of reading, the affection for books, I think I'll save all of that for that talk. But I want to close simply by saying the following. On pages 121 to 24, we learn about the fact that in 1950 or thereabouts, Ahmed Kathrada visited Auschwitz. He visited Auschwitz. I think it's going to be very interesting to think about the relationship between the Holocaust and as far as I'm aware, no one has really touched upon it. The relationship between the Holocaust and the memory of the Holocaust and the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. I first became aware of this visit to Auschwitz by Ahmed Kathrada. He had gone to Poland. He had actually gone to Berlin, I think, as a youth representative for some international conference. So he was representing South Africa, and then during the course of that visit, then he went to Poland, and when he went to Poland, he went to Auschwitz as well. So he describes here in this interview with with his interlocutor. This appears on pages 121 to 24. He describes very briefly his visit, what he recalled from that visit. The interviewer says that his visit to the Auschwitz concentration camp in post-war Poland remains for him an indelible example of what happens when racism and fascism are in control, right? But here's the most interesting part, and I'll actually just quote very briefly and then just conclude with that. So the impression that sticks in my mind, first of all, this is Kathy speaking now, because he's asked, what did you see? Was a glass container full of gold that is extracted from teeth before people are sent to their death. Just the gold, they removed the gold and kept the gold. Many of you are aware of the fact that the fillings were removed by the Nazi guards from, so whenever Jewish people and others were brought, it was mainly Jewish people, but we know there were a great many non-Jews who were also brought to the concentration camps, right, including Auschwitz. They would each person was inspected, and then they would remove the gold fillings from the teeth, and confiscate any other jewelry that anybody might have. So this is what Kathy says struck him the most. Then the other thing we remember is lampshades made of human skin, because the Nazi doctors used to carry out all sorts of experiments in the concentration camps. There were the gas chambers where they gassed people to death, and I think next to it were the crematoriums where they burned them. Outside in the street were a lot of bones, human bones. And then the next line, I was astonished to read it. He says, and I brought back just a few bones. And so the interviewer must have raised her eyebrows, right? Because he says, yes, you could pick up bones, human bones. What did you do with them? I brought them back home to South Africa, and I used to keep them in a bottle. At political meetings, I used to go and show people what the logical outcome of racism can be. It was quite effective. Bones. The logical conclusion of racism. Do you still have them? And Kathy says, one day in one of the police raids, the police found this bottle in my flat. They asked me what it was. I explained to them that they were human bones of people killed by the Nazis. So their reaction was, it's just Jews, isn't it? They said it in Afrikaans. These seker Jode, ne? They were unconcerned about the victims, but they took the bones away. And of course, I end with this because we're at a juncture now where Israel, which was founded with the idea that there would be now a homeland for the Jews who had been exterminated in massive numbers, 6 million, right? And what is it that the victims are now doing, right? How easy is this transition from victims to perpetrators? It's something to think about. But this is what's so gentle about the book too. It's the way in which he speaks about all of this, because then later on he will speak about the humanity of the oppressor, and I conclude with that, right? Where he gives a little anecdote when he says that long before he was sent to Robben Island, Kathy was in jail long before that, right? He had gone to jail for other political offenses, and one of the first times that he was ever sent to jail, when he was but a young man of 21. So, he's sent to jail, and during the time that, for political offense, and, his and he's back in the area where he was born. So this is where he came back there and started engaging in some political activity in that area. And during the time that he was in jail, he wasn't allowed to shave, so he grew a beard. And he says that nonetheless, and remember, this is the period of apartheid. Nonetheless, what happens there is that the people, the police, they know him. He's a local boy. But they're the oppressors. And this is apartheid. And they know that his mother wants to see him. Right? And so they take him to see his mother. It's a different story that she got a real shock because she could barely recognize, almost in a way, her son with his full beard at that point in time. But he was a political prisoner under apartheid, and the security police, the local security police, say, "We'll let you see your mother. We'll take you there. You spend some time with her." Right? So these are the kinds of things that make this book enormously interesting. And I suggest not only reading this book, if you can grab a copy somewhere, but also delving deeply into the life of Ahmed Kathrada.